My name is Ben Kemp. I'm the operations manager for Grant Cottage State Historic Site, and I'm so pleased to welcome today Ann Clothier. She's the director of education at the Saratoga County History Center, and that's at Brookside Museum in Ballston Spa, New York. So we're going to be talking today about a Civil War soldier, the story of a Civil War soldier from Saratoga County, New York, and specifically from a regiment known as the 77th New York Infantry. And the significance of that is that there is a monument in the center of Saratoga Springs, New York, that commemorates the 77th New York that was unfortunately damaged last year by vandalism, and it will be fully repaired sometime this summer. That is going to take place, but it also brings a lot of attention to what the monuments represent and what they memorialize. And this story today will certainly be a part of that. My grandfather fought with the 77th New York. His name was Truman Duell. I don't know if he knew the gentleman we'll be talking about today, but certainly they all deserve to be remembered. And so we're going to sit back and enjoy a presentation. And as we remember these veterans and many others, we appreciate their sacrifice. And without further ado, I present Ann Clothier. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Ben, for having me join you for this and to share some information about Alonzo Bump. So again, today we're going to be talking about Alonzo Bump, and we're going to be getting into his life, his family, his experiences before the war, during, and after. But before I get started, again, I just wanted to mention that these letters that we're going to be focusing on, the letters that have allowed us to get to know Alonzo Bump, are part of the collection at Brookside Museum, home of the Saratoga County History Center. And we are located in Ballston Spa in a 1792 hotel building. And we have a fairly large collection of books, objects, photographs, various documents, and archival collections. Now, we also do a lot of programs and exhibits and things like that. So we are planning to be reopening at the very end of June, and with a whole new set of exhibits at that time as well. So I encourage you to check out our website, and that is brooksidemuseum.org. And also be sure to check us out on Facebook and other social media places as well. So these letters that I mentioned were written by Alonzo Bump. They were primarily written home to his wife and Mary Bump. And so these are the letters that have allowed us to really explore Alonzo's life and that of his family as well. But before we get started, one thing I like to do is, sadly, we don't have a photograph of what Alonzo looked like. We know photographs were taken of him, but none came to us with the donation of the letters. But I also like to show some of the faces of Alonzo's comrades in the 77th Regiment. And so here we have, as I have labeled, not Alonzo and Mary Bump. However, this is someone who served with him, and this is James Sanford Clothier. And so this is actually a distant relative of mine on my father's side. And James Sanford Clothier lived in Corinth, where I am also originally from. And he was, according to the family story that came down through multiple generations, very proud of the sort of gold, the brass buttons on his coat. He was a farm boy and hadn't really owned or worn anything quite so formal or ceremonial before as his uniform that he was issued by the 77th. And so he had his portrait taken. Sadly, we don't know exactly who he is posed with here in this photograph. We don't know if it's his sister or a sweetheart. We're not sure. And we're still looking into that. But this is an image that the Corinth Museum now has. And but again, it is very possible that Alonzo might have known James Sanford Clothier. It is also possible that, oh, and I also want to include a bit about what happened to James. And James was 21 years old and unfortunately did not last very long. He ended up dying of disease, a fever in Virginia. And this is important to remember because that happened a lot. So often when we think of the Civil War or any war, we think of these brave soldiers dying in battle. And while that certainly did happen, there were also so many soldiers that were taken through disease as well, or the after effects of injuries that they received in battle when infections set in or different treatments to the wounds did not work out as hoped. So it's important to remember that there were so many of these soldiers who passed away in hospitals, lingering on for a long time with all sorts of different diseases like typhoid fever or dysentery or things like that. Now, another of my personal connections with the 77th Regiment and another individual that may have known Alonzo was Andrew Miller. And this is my great-great-great-great-grandfather. And so he enlisted at Ballston Spa. And so he enlisted in 1861. And so he went in and he lasted for a while and he did survive, but he was just discharged for disability. And in his case, it was intestinal disease, most likely a form of dysentery or something like that, that made it really impossible for him to be an effective, efficient soldier. And so it really disabled him. And I heard stories coming down through the family about how ill he was when he did finally get to come home. And so again, we think of these soldiers being wounded. We think of these amputees coming home with these very visual reminders of wounds they received in battle. But there were also many invisible wounds as well, and invisible conditions like these illnesses, these sicknesses. And also, it's important to remember that so many soldiers were also affected mentally and emotionally by the experience as well. And so today we know this as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and things like that. But so many soldiers were affected by that, but it wasn't fully understood at the time. It's not even fully understood today. So when we think about these returning soldiers and the experiences of them and their families, it's important to remember all that they went through. Another piece of family history, this was a Bible that was presented to Andrew Miller, my relative, that has come down through the family. And so this one was given to him around the time of the war as well. There were lots of different sort of charitable organizations that were distributing items of necessary use to the soldiers, and that might include rubberized blankets for keeping them warm and dry on rainy campaigns. It could include wool socks, wool mittens. It could include fresh shirts, and it also could include things like this Bible for reading material and also sort of spiritual support throughout the campaign as well. Now back to those letters of Alonzo Bump. Now, these are letters that came to the museum as part of a deaccession from another organization that was trying to focus their collection to their local area. And so they felt that these letters would be best housed at the Saratoga County Historical Society, as we were known at the time. And we're very glad that they chose us to pass these letters along to. And these letters are really amazing resources. And you really get to explore the feelings and the thoughts and the opinions of this one soldier who served with the 77th New York State Volunteers. And so starting off, outside of the letters, if we go into the census records, we can find out a little bit about what Alonzo was doing right before the war started. And here we are looking at the 1860 census for Victory, which is a small village over near Schuylerville. And so here we can see that we have a household headed by Ann Robertson, who is a 40-year-old female. And then as we go down the line, we see a lot of other Robertsons. We see Ellen and Martha or Marcia, and they are teenage girls. And then we see Alonzo Bump, and he is a 20-ish-year-old male. Some of the records disagree about his exact age at various times. And followed by Mary Bump, an 18-year-old female, and Maddie Bump, and she's listed as 10/12. And so that, in this case, is a fraction. So she was a 10-month-old infant at this time. And then we have the mysterious Mrs. Bump. And we're still trying to figure out exactly who this is. It is possible that this is Alonzo's mother that is living with them. She would be very young. However, census records, especially early census records, can be notorious with errors when it comes to age. In fact, again, we believe Alonzo's age is incorrect in this one. And a lot of it came down to the fact that whoever happened to be home when the census taker came through, they might have done a lot of shrugging and saying, I don't know, I think they're such and such an age. And so that is just one way. Also, transcription errors is another way that these errors come down through and cause a lot of confusion to genealogists and researchers in the future. So again, we've got Alonzo Bump living in this household with Ann Robertson, her two teenage daughters, and as well as, again, a woman named Mary Bump. So Mary is another daughter of Ann Robertson. And so we can also see in a later column, and this is the occupations column, we see that they are listed as FACT. And so that means they work in the local factory. They are factory laborers. And the factory that they were working in was actually a textile mill. And so there is still a structure over at Victory or Victory Mills. That main structure was built in 1918, but there had been other large factory buildings there previously. And so these mill structures were located conveniently along Fish Creek, an excellent source of hydropower. And so these textile mills were producing at various points a lot of cotton. And in 1850, the cotton mill employed 160 men, 209 women, and working at 12,500 spindles and 309 looms, and produced over 1.8 million yards of cotton cloth. Now, by 1877, the company employed 700 and had a capacity of 26,000 spindles with an annual production of 4.4 million yards of goods. So that's a little bit of the background, just showing the sheer scale of what was being produced over in Victory. And in a lot of documentation, Alonzo is listed as a weaver. So he was someone who was working in one of these textile mills, primarily at the looms. And so, as you could see in that last census document, he had his wife as well as two sisters-in-law working at the factory as well. And that seems to coincide with that 1850 statistic that there were 160 men and 209 women working there. And so these textile mills were a major employer of women. Now, once we get into the beginning of the Civil War, we see all sorts of broadsides begin to appear, trying to get soldiers to enlist. And so these are things that Alonzo most likely would have seen if he went to the local general store, if he went to the post office, if he walked through town. And this is something that would have always been on his mind, I think, because they were really trying to get these able-bodied young men to enlist into these various regiments. Now, Saratoga County certainly had a few different regiments that were actively recruiting here. Today, we're focusing primarily on the 77th. There was another one, the 115th, that was very active around here as well as many others, including artillery regiments and things like that. Now, these broadsides are from a little bit further afield, and we can see one of them is from the town of Otsego. But they are really trying to get these able-bodied young men to join their particular unit. And there was also a lot of competition involved between communities, between regiments, between officers. They wanted to be able to fill their ranks very quickly, very easily, and to be able to say, I was first. Look at how many wonderful trained soldiers I have. And certainly the training part was a whole nother chapter for these officers to deal with, because a lot of these were farm boys, a lot of these were factory workers. So they did have to be trained in the ways of the soldier. But they wanted to be able to fill up their units as quickly as possible. And also, if one were to open a newspaper, you would see even more reminders about the ongoing war and the desire to build the ranks. Now, the 77th is an unusual regiment in that it is symbolically numbered. And so often when I'm working with students, because I do a 7th grade program with these letters sometimes, I'm trying to get them to think about why the number 77 would have local significance. And also another hint with this, it's a bit of an obscure hint. You really have to know your local geography and your history. But the regiment was also known as the Bemis Heights Regiment or the Bemis Heights Battalion. And the number 77 and the reference to Bemis Heights, these are references to the battles of Saratoga. And so they wanted that number 77 to be associated with their regiment. So because battles of Saratoga happened in 1777. And so this was a major part of their marketing, of their recruitment. And as we can see from the snippet that we have here on the page, they were quite stirring in their attempts to inspire the local populace to support the 77th, or if they were, as they say, an able-bodied young man, to join up with the 77th. And they're referring to some of the recent events. This was August of 1861 when this one was published. And they said, traitors in arms seek to overthrow our Constitution and to seize our capital. Let us go and help defend them. Who will despond because we lost the battle at Bull Run? Our fathers lost the battle at Bunker Hill, but it taught them how to gain the victory at Bemis Heights. So they're reminding the local people, many of whom their fathers, grandfathers, uncles, great uncles might have actually served and participated in the battles of Saratoga. They are recalling this Revolutionary War history and talking about Bunker Hill and how that didn't go so well. And then going on to talk about Bemis Heights. Again, another reference to those battles of Saratoga. Let us learn wisdom from disaster and send overwhelming numbers into the field. Let farmers, mechanics, merchants, and all classes, for the liberties of all are at stake, aid in organizing companies. I will cheerfully assist in procuring the necessary papers. So this one was published by McKean, again, from Saratoga Springs in 1861. And so again, this was part of that marketing. Now, the communities also were actively involved in, again, keeping track of who was joining and from where. And this is a quota list of Saratoga County communities and how many volunteers were expected during various points in the war. And so at this particular point in time, they were looking for a number of volunteers broken down as a percentage of the town's population. And so we can see references again to Ballston, Corinth, Greenfield, Milton, Monroe, and of course, the largest at this point in time, certainly Saratoga Springs. And so, and again, they are trying to get 500 volunteers out of the total population. So eventually, Alonzo Bump is persuaded one way or another to join. And so these are his muster records, documents keeping track of military service. And again, this is where things get a little bit confusing with regard to his age. At this point, they are referring to him as 26. However, that could also be a reference to when this paperwork was filled out or retranscribed, perhaps at the end of his service. But again, these documents can lead to a bit of confusion sometimes, especially when compared to the census documents. But he was born in Granville, New York, and his occupation is listed as a weaver with hazel eyes, brown hair, light complexion, and 5'5" tall. Now, once he joined up, there's a good chance he might have spent a bit of time at Camp Schuyler in Saratoga Springs. And they refer to it as the appropriate name given to the branch military depot, where the Bemis Heights Regiment is now filling up. And so, once again, Camp Schuyler, again, a reference to the local campaigns during the American Revolution and a reference to General Philip Schuyler. So again, continuing that theme of trying to echo and make people think of their local history, and in many cases, again, their personal and family histories as well. Now, once they had completed some of their training, the soldiers would be heading out and to go see the world, as Alonzo says at one point. And so they head out on campaign. And so there were certainly a variety of different activities that the soldiers participated in. Certainly lots of training, lots of drilling, lots of marching, and marching through all sorts of weather and conditions. In January of 1863, he writes, "Marching for 2 days, and it commences to rain. The mud is so deep." And so by May of 1863, "I don't think that I shall ever be a pack peddler," someone who went door to door selling trinkets or various items in a community. "I don't think I shall ever be a pack peddler, for I don't like the work and to make a regular pack mule of us when we march." So he's been loaded up with equipment. He's carrying a tent or half of a tent, because often soldiers would sort of partner up and each have half of a tent. He's carrying his blankets, he's carrying his food rations, he's carrying all the equipment he needs for his weapon, and various other things as well. So he's uncomfortable, to say the least. And by July of 1863, "Have to march sore feet or not. We have marched over 100 miles in 4 days." So again, that is quite the physical output of labor for him, not only to walk so far, but to be carrying a lot as well. And so as this kept going, and some of the soldiers became a little bit dissatisfied with the conditions, they also were offering great inducements for men to re-enlist, and even offering 30-day furloughs for those who promised to re-enlist. And they were also switching around a lot. They were offering enlistments for the Navy or heavy artillery or the cavalry as well, he mentions in his letters. Now, certainly there were attempts to maintain comfort during this time as well. And we can see in this image from the Library of Congress that they sometimes even created almost small cabins if they were going to be in one place for a long time, especially over winter months. And he talks about, let's see, making a bed out of cedar boughs in 1863. And he also talks about just being tired of lying on the ground, want to sleep in a bed. And by the fall of 1863, actually adds a chimney into the tent. And by December of 1863, we have built us up good log tents. And that's an example of a log tent we can see in that Library of Congress image. Now, of course, another source of discussion and complaint was certainly the food. And sometimes the rations, the supply was good and available. But then other times, especially if the supply train and supply chain wasn't keeping up, they had very little indeed. And in September of 1862, he refers to having had hard crackers for 2 days and complains about insufficient food. And then in April of 1863, 5 days rations: potatoes, turnips, beets, bread, pork, coffee, sugar, molasses, carrots. We live like peacocks in the clover, he says. And then only a month later, getting tired of hardtack and coffee and salt pork. Now, occasionally they did have opportunities to eat elsewhere or obtain food elsewhere, either through trade, purchase, local charitable efforts among the local population, and also sometimes some looting possibly as well. He doesn't really get into talking about that, but he does talk about a description of a meal at a farmer's house. So they were able to, again, sometimes join local people as well. And he does buy some additional food as well, in addition to what it is rationed or given to him by the army. He can buy butter and cheese, eggs, and things like that to enhance his diet. And also that depended drastically on where you were. He says in 1863, here in Pennsylvania, we can buy something to eat. And in Virginia, we could not get anything to eat, for the farmers were all rebels. Now, on the home front, I want to talk a little bit about Mary and Maddie and everything that they were going through, because we do get to learn a bit about that through the letters. Now, one of the most frequent questions we get about these letters is if we have anything that Mary had written. And sadly, we do not. There could be a few reasons for this. Probably the biggest one being that if Mary wrote the letter and was sending it to Alonzo, he would have to carry that with him. And he already was overloaded and carrying very heavy packs. They were going through torrential downpours, things like that. So as much as he probably may have liked to keep her letters and keep them close and keep them safe, that may not have been practical in a true survival situation. And so either they could have been used for starting fires, could have been left behind, could have been lost. So sadly, Mary's letters do not survive. We have Alonzo's because those were the letters he was sending home. And it seems like Mary really kept those safe and kept them together. And so that is why we have a very one-sided correspondence. We are certainly grateful to have that one side of the correspondence. And we can learn about Mary and Maddie through those letters as well, even though they weren't written by Mary. Alonzo does refer to them and refer to what's going on at home a great deal in his letters, and is trying to keep track of what's going on there and what they need. And so in September of 1863, we can tell through the letters that Mary considered working at a local textile mill. And he said, "You said you looked for work in the cloth room but did not get a job. I don't want you to work in the mill unless you want to, for I think that I am man enough to board you, and in a pinch, I guess I can get you boarded somewhere in Victory. But if you do go in the mill, it won't be because I want you to, for I do not, but then I have no injections of you working, and I'm glad to hear that you have got some ambition. So he is trying to actually be a fairly supportive husband there, in saying that he wants her to, if she wants to work in the mill, great, but he doesn't want her to feel like she's forced to go back to work and working in the mill. Alonzo is attempting to send home money as much as he can to support his wife and his daughter. And we can also see there his reference to think that I am man enough to board you. So it's even his masculinity, he feels, is on the line to be able to support his wife and his child and make sure that they have a place to live. And he also had concerns. It wasn't just about her having to work outside the home. He knew, he had worked in the mills. He knew how dangerous it could be. And also in the fall of 1863, Mary may have, I don't want you to work in the mill anymore, for I'd rather pay your board than to have you get your arm taken off. I'd rather you do housework if you want to work so bad. So this reference to an arm being taken off, these textile mills could, again, be very dangerous places. And he was worried about her health and safety, and saying that he would prefer that she would do house cleaning if she really needed the money. And he sometimes also tried some other methods to earn money. He also talks about illegally gambling to help Mary out financially, trying to get a little bit of extra money to send home. And he also seemed to think in his letters that Mary was unhappy with the amount of money that he sent home at various times. And the other thing that I'm struck by is how easily and freely and comfortably they were sending cash through the mail. And even today, sending cash through the mail is discouraged. But it's the 1860s, and they're just sending cash back and forth in their letters. And there were times where Mary was actually the one sending money to Alonzo. And in fact, in January of 1863, Alonzo asked Mary to send him $1. And there's a reference to Mary's savings also in the same letter. Her savings amounted to $16 that she had on hand at home. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, Alonzo did have concerns about the safety of the mills in Victory, and had concerns about Mary working there. And this was one incident that happened in 1864, and this happened in February of that year. This was an unusual event. It wasn't so much an accident that happened with a particular piece of weaving equipment or things like this. It was actually a boiler it was quite the destructive boiler accident, as they say here. And it happened, of all times, in the middle of the night. And it took place at 2 o'clock on Saturday morning, when many of the structures in the nearby community were filled with slumbering occupants, all unconscious of danger. And it is really wonderful that scores of people were not killed or wounded. Thus far, only 2 of the victims have died, but several others were injured. So a boiler exploded and actually sent parts of that machinery moving through the local buildings. And so there was a steam apparatus and that had a pressure issue. And it exploded, steam came pouring out, and the boiler, with a terrible report, started from its place in the mill, taking a northerly course and passing through the following buildings, all of which, except the last, were demolished: Buchanan and Bullard's paper mill, a shed attached to it, Mr. Dwyer's shoe store, Dwyer's house, Lane's saloon, Farley's tailor shop, the Union store, J. Henry's harness shop, the post office, Smith's jewelry store, and then a private house. And the boiler halted within a few feet of the bed where someone was actually sleeping. And so Mrs. Dwyer was killed in bed. Mr. Dwyer was so badly injured he died a half hour later at Potter's Hotel. Mrs. Lane was so badly injured and not expected to live, and her child had a limb broken. And so this, again, was quite the event, especially for the middle of the night. And we know about this both through local news reports, but also through the letters back and forth between Mary and Alonzo. So Mary must have shared this information, either written it out, sent along a newspaper clipping, something like that. And so his response in February of 1864, let's see. I know you wrote in your letter that the boiler in the paper mill blowed up and killed 2 or 3. Dear, that ain't nothing. If you was down here in the time of battle, then you might say it was a site where you could see the dead lying on the ground by hundreds, besides the wounded. Then you might talk about a sight. So that is, we're seeing a little bit of Alonzo's trauma, his mental and emotional trauma coming through in this letter. So Mary has shared something very tragic and terrible that has happened just down the street from where they live. And Alonzo isn't quite as empathetic as he often sounds through some of his other letters. And he's comparing what Mary might have seen or heard about in their own neighborhood with something that he saw every time there was a battle. And so this letter, I feel, is very telling about his mental and emotional state at this time. He's becoming very jaded. And so where he's saying that, oh, you only had 2 or 3 dead up there. You should be down here during a battle. Now, the communities were very concerned about the well-being of their soldiers. And so it is amazing how much was sent from the communities to the soldiers. And here we see an illustration from the tribute book. So 6 and 86, knitting for the soldiers is the caption. So there's a 6-year-old child as well as an 86-year-old grandmother knitting socks for these soldiers to have. But it wasn't just limited to wool socks. A lot of food was being sent to the soldiers as well, including baked goods, mince pies, fruitcake, ginger snaps, etc. And so brandy was also being sent, as was bread. And there's also a reference around in the winter of 1863 that Mary had sent bread, pie, and cake to Alonzo. He writes that it arrived, it was a bit moldy, but we ate it anyway, and it was very good. So they even were sending butter sent in a box by the family, hand-picked cherries, hopefully dried, chestnuts, and things like that. And there were also lists that appeared in the local newspapers about what were good things to send to support the soldiers. And again, blankets to keep them warm, rubberized blankets to keep them dry in those rainstorms and in the mud. Again, a lot of references to socks. And again, when I work with those 7th graders, we talk a little bit about how if they get socks for Christmas or birthday, it seems like a silly gift. But if you are marching 100 miles in 4 days, like Alonzo was, as we heard in that letter earlier, having good socks and good footwear, that's huge. That is a major thing. So that's why socks were such a common and popular item to send to the soldiers. Now, again, there was a lot of problems with economic hardship throughout the war. And it does sound like in April of 1863, Mary is picking up extra work, and Alonzo is worried, and he says, I'd rather send you money than you work yourself to death. So she's trying to, again, get some extra money on hand to be able to pay their way to buy food and such. So he was sending home money periodically, but there were also times when the army was late in paying their soldiers. And so there's some references to that throughout the letters as well. And so another thing that we learn about through the letters, again, we heard a little bit about it through his reaction to the boiler explosion, but we do hear about here and there his feelings about the war and his feelings about battle. And so his feelings toward the enemy in June of 1863, he says, again, referring to Confederates, "I have seen a good many of them, but I did not feel as though I wanted to kill nor hurt them." He even says by August of 1863, "I think the Rebs are getting sick of this war." And so, but as time goes on and he's endured more and more, his sympathy for the opposing side does seem to dwindle as well. He also has very limited patience for deserters. And so let's see, lots deserting every day. And let's see, he talks about, he says that he doesn't want to desert in spite of the fact that he desperately wants to get home and see his family. And he also talks about being desensitized, essentially. In August of 1863, "I've walked over the dead man when it made my heart beat like a trip hammer, but now I don't think anything of seeing a dead man. But the worst of all is to see a man wounded, and you can't stop to help him, when if you could stop him, give him a drink of water, it would save his life." And by November of 1863, "The fort that the 6th Maine took was full of dead, and I looked at them all. Some had their heads and some a leg shot off, and they were killed in all ways." So this leads us to our another one, the aftermath, seeing what these battles did and what they left behind. So he does also spend some time burying the dead. And he also worked on raising money at one point to send a friend named Joe home. So that implies that they were Joe's comrades were trying to raise money to have him embalmed, a relatively new technology of the Civil War, to be able to be sent home and buried here in Saratoga County. And so, so there were many who did not have that luxury, either due to time, season, just the sheer quantity of casualties, that they weren't able to be embalmed and sent home. So many cemeteries surrounded the battlefields in that area. And here we see, again, a view of one of those burying grounds. And he does talk about the depletion of Union forces through death or wounding. He says, "We lost on our side about 400 killed and wounded." And he does also talk about the enemy taking supplies and personal effects of the soldiers. And that was something that happened a lot. And in an era before formalized dog tags or military issued ID, this was also a problem, because if a soldier had pinned their name inside of their coat or inside of their boots, and then someone else came along from either side, honestly, and took those boots, because footwear is footwear. And if the person who had been wearing it is no longer among the living, and that boot looked like it would fit you, well, opportunity for a new pair of boots. And so, but if you had your name tucked in your boot and someone else took that, when it came time to try to identify the bodies and to inter or bury them, it wasn't known who they were. So there were an incredible number of missing in action, unidentified soldiers' remains. And so that was a major challenge during and after the war, to try and help the families figure out what had happened to their loved ones. So eventually, the end of the war comes, and here we see a stereo view of some of the soldiers marching home on Broadway in New York City. And we can see that bystanders have even crawled and climbed up into the trees to watch the spectacle. So there was a great deal of celebration at the end of the war, but also it was a time for many, they didn't have their loved ones coming home. They had been lost due to disease or due to battle. And so the question always is, what happened to Alonzo? Did he make it? Did he survive? And once again, if we return to the good old census, we can see that in 1870, he has now moved to Cohoes, another textile mill town, and he has his own household. So he is, there he is, a 32-year-old Alonzo Bump, and he is listed as working in a cotton mill. Mary, 29 years old, is keeping house. Maddie, and she is 10 years old and at school. Now, if we take a moment, we can also see that they haven't moved far from Mary's family. We look down just a little bit lower, we can see that Marcia Richards and Ann Robertson, we can see that they are living next door. So while he does have his own dwelling, it seems, his in-laws are not far behind. But again, it looks like they are working in the cotton mill at Cohoes. So the family was reunited, and Alonzo actually survived and lived until 1905. And so he got to, again, see Mary again. He got to see his daughter Maddie again. Maddie married but never had any children, so Alonzo doesn't have any direct descendants, though there are some relatives around, it seems. And so he is buried, I believe that this is at the Waterford Cemetery. And so that is a little tiny bit about Alonzo Bump, soldier of the 77th. And so if anyone has any questions or wants to learn more about Alonzo or the letters or anything else in the collection at Brookside Museum at the Saratoga County History Center, certainly reach out to us through our website, brooksidemuseum.org, and we would be happy to help you out with that. All right, so pausing sharing, and I think I've wrapped that up. Is there anything, any questions that you have, Ben, or anything that I could clarify or discuss further?
No, it was a wonderful presentation as always. Definitely appreciated. And, you know, I've always been fascinated by the insight that you can get from the personal letters of what you could call the average or common soldier. We say average, but it's not really an appropriate name. You know, everybody that, you know, served their country in that way was above average, and to be able to do that and to make that decision, and obviously Alonzo was one of them, to leave his family and children. And, you know, as you mentioned, it just gives a great insight into the mind, whether or not they realized they were revealing these things in their letters. You know, in some ways the letters, you know, we wish to have a picture, we wish to see what they look like, but in some ways the letters are more important. I had a Civil War ancestor that left neither, and that's very difficult. But again, you put together what you can, and you realize there's still a story there. There's always still a story there that you can tell. And certainly these letters and these diaries that came from the war, you know, really give us you know, can really provide a better picture and just allow us to appreciate so much more what these men and women did to preserve the nation. And you know, I will be happy to see the monument fully restored in Congress Park in Saratoga Springs, to memorialize Alonzo and you know, his fellow soldiers that fought for Saratoga County. And you said the letters are in the collection of the Saratoga County History Center, and so are they scanned in and available for reading, or do you have to? How can you access them?
So at the moment, they are in archival housing and things like that. There have been some researchers that have been working on those, and there is some discussion of hopefully publishing them at some point. Certainly, COVID has interrupted things a little bit and access and things like that. But we're hoping that that project may continue, and hopefully there will be access to those letters in the near future in much broader form. So other authors have used them as sources for their books as well. Morrow did a book on the 77th that used some of Alonzo's letters, and also I believe Larry Handy has also used them for a book about the 77th as well. So there are some books that have drawn upon Alonzo's works, along his letters. So
Yeah, it's wonderful, and probably takes a little bit to transcribe some of these. You know,
oh yes,
the handwriting and the grammar was, you know, has something to be desired, but it has a flavor all of its own, and it tells its own story about, you know, people's upbringing and their education. And I think that's part of the story as well. So I think you've drawn a lot of valuable information out of the Alonzo's letters, and I appreciate you sharing that today with our audience.
glad to be here, and thank you very much for making it possible.